Okay, Robbie assured me this would be simple, but don't you leave. First, I'd like to say just a little bit about what I'm doing now. I didn't realize there'd be so many neighbor ranchers here, so I shouldn't have written so much stuff on that bio, because they all know me. I moved to Colorado about 36 years ago and had ranched here until 2002. I came with cattle facts, and then after several other positions, I went to ranching full time. Had a ranch in Nebraska, sold it, and currently own a ranch down between La Junta and Trinidad. In the course of my work at Cattle Facts, I became real good friends with a fellow named Dub Waldrop, who was the CEO of Spade Ranches, and Dub and I remained close through the years. And in '92, Dub called me and said he was getting ready to retire, and would I consider coming down and running the Spades? Well, in '92, it had been raining a lot, and the cattle market was good, and I thought, well, within 3 or 4 years, I'll own the Spades. So I declined. Well, in 2002, Dub called back, and we wound up having for the year on our ranch down there 3.8 inches of rain for that 12-month period. I was down to about 34 cows on the ranch, and it was dry in Montana where I had a lot of yearlings. And I said, Dub, I believe I'll come talk to you this time. So we worked out a deal, and I moved down to Lubbock to run the Spades. My son Andy, my middle son, had just graduated, just gotten his master's degree, the IRM Masters, from here at CSU, and he's been back running the our own personal ranching operation while I've been in Texas with the Spades. And the only mistake I made was not getting him back sooner and getting me gone. Let me start by saying that my topic is why I use planned grazing in a semi-arid environment. And I would like to address mainly my ranching operation here in Colorado. I've got more years of data on it. I've got more direct involvement in the rotational grazing program there. So we'll talk about the Colorado ranch, if that's okay. I guess the thing that I'd like to first tell you is that up until now, I've been here for these meetings the last 2 days, and up until now you've had highly educated and articulate speakers that are used to speaking before big groups. Well, now you've got me, so get ready. One of the things that Tim asked me to talk about was risk management by using rotational grazing. And to be honest with you, I racked my brain about that, and I've come up with 3 main areas of risk in my ranching operation. One is market risk of what your calves bring. Well, I can't do much about that through rotation or through a grazing system. The other would be the cost of your inputs. And as I've always said, the way to insulate yourself from from highly variable input costs is don't use them. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do with through my grazing system is to get as far away from buying feed inputs, fuel, and other inputs that are influenced by those costs. So that's one way that I try to manage my risk through the use of grazing management. And then weather, I try to mitigate the effects of drought through my grazing. But I think that's not as important as to try to. What I would like to try to do is explain why I use a rotational grazing system. We've heard a lot of talk the last 2 days about a lot of studies that say there has been no scientific study that says that rotational grazing has improved cattle performance or range conditions compared to just continual grazing. And so why use it? Well, I'd like to explain why. And let me say this. I'm not, as a rancher, I'm not here to try to sell the concept of rotational grazing or planned grazing system. It's not because I don't believe in it, because I do. But it's because, I don't know how to say this exactly, but if I, as I look at an industry, if I can find something that's working for me and other people in the industry aren't using it, then I have a competitive advantage. So it's not necessarily to my advantage to try to promote the use of any practice like that. Now, that sounds selfish, but what I'm coming to you from is I'm not here to try to sell you on rotational grazing. I'm going to tell you why I use it. You can do whatever you want to do. I'm not on any kind of a crusade. I've tried to arrange my reasons for using rotational grazing in an order of increasing importance to me. So I'll start with what I would say was the least important and then work up. And now it remains to be seen if I can work this. Ha! It worked. Okay, the first thing is you can't stop checking your cattle, you can't stop checking fences or water, but you can do it on about 1/10 of your ranch rather than the whole ranch. Now what I mean by that is, if I have my cattle concentrated into one herd, I go to that one pasture, I can get a good look at my cattle, I can check my minerals, I can check my water, and then I'm freed up to do other things. I can handle more cattle. I can, it just frees up a lot more of my time. And that was especially true, we found, when we were feeding in the winter. It cuts way down on either the fuel that you burn, the use of your equipment, or horse tracks. It's much more efficient. The next thing is, you still have to destock if it doesn't rain. These rotational grazing, in my opinion, a rotational grazing system isn't this cure-all that suddenly you can go through any drought, you can double your stocking rate, but you're still going to have to destock if it doesn't rain, but you can accurately figure how much time you have until that has to be done. In other words, if I have 10 pastures ahead of me, and I know that I've got an average of 12 graze days in each of those pastures, I've got 120 days. Now, if I get back around and it hasn't rained in that 120 days, I better go to ordering some trucks. I used to see these ads that said you can drought-proof your ranch using, different grazing systems. Well, when you get, I'm here to tell you that when you get 3.8 inches of rain in a year, your ranch is not drought-proof, and there's nothing you can do to make it drought-proof at that time. So that leads me to this point. You still have to wait for rain to grow grass. The simple fact is that rain grows grass and cattle consume grass. And if you continually consume more grass than you grow, bad things happen in the world of grass. I mean, it's that simple. So if you have rotated through all your pastures, if you haven't gotten any rain, then there is no magic bullet. That you're still going to have to destock. But what I found is, after the drought of 2002, after I had destocked, when it began to rain and I restocked, I believe my country came back faster than it ever had before, and more vigorously. And it wasn't but a year before I was fully stocked again. And that was a considerable change, I think. Now, with a rotational grazing system, you don't introduce new grass species. You don't begin to grow grasses that have never grown in that area. But you give the good ones equal opportunity to compete with the less desirable grasses. And let me give you an example of that. I leased a ranch back in the 80s up in El Paso County, where we lived. It's where our children were raised. It was north of Calhoun, between Calhoun and Kiowa. And when I came there, it took that ranch over. I still remember to this day, I was horseback riding through those pastures, and I would come across perfectly circular areas, probably 15 to 20 feet across, that the grass was about this tall. And everywhere around it, the grass was a foot tall. Well, I'm an astute observer, and I knew immediately that those were UFO visitation sites. Obvious. But within 2 or 3 years of after I'd instituted a rotational grazing system, those circles, which I marked, became big blue stem. Well, nobody thought there was big blue stem in that area. But when you rested it, when it wasn't constantly being grazed every time it got 2 inches tall, we began to get some big blue stem heading out. I kept that ranch for 16 years. By the end of that 16 years, we had several hundred acres of big blue stem interspersed with the rest of our grasses. Now, it didn't, in 16 years, the ranch didn't become all big blue stem. And I guess what I'm saying is it's a slow process, but it does give those more desirable grasses an opportunity to compete with the less desirable. And what that leads to is you can't change the seasons, but you'll see more cool season and warm season mixes of grass. You'll begin to see grasses green up earlier in the spring, and they'll stay green later in the fall. We have not been feeding, and probably a lot of people in southeastern in Colorado haven't been, but we haven't been feeding yet. We probably will after this. May have to feed for a day or two, but we try to keep from feeding as much as possible. If my cows are eating something that I grow on that ranch versus something that I pour out of the back of a pickup, I'm money ahead. And I've really got to concentrate on that as the price of all these inputs have gone up. Down there on the ranch on the Pishpaw down in southeastern Colorado, when I got there, the species that I've kind of began to monitor there was a little bit of what's called vine mesquite. And I don't know if many of you have seen vine mesquite. It's more of a southern grass, but we had just a few areas of it. And it grows by seed or by runners, and it's a good grass. And we're getting a lot of it now. We're getting it in a lot of different areas as it begins to spread, and that's been kind of what I've monitored. And a western wheat is a lot more prevalent than it used to be. One thing I would say is that I don't feel like you can double your stocking rate. But I think you can increase it somewhat over a moderately stocked, continual grazed program. Give you an example, we lease a pasture that joins us, and we continually graze in that pasture because the way it's set up, we just have to keep a herd there. And we run one animal unit per 55 acres on that. So if there were 1,000 acres, we'd run about 18 cows. Well, over on our more intensively managed grazing system, we're running a cow on about 47 acres. So we'd have 21 cows on that same acreage. Well, that's 3 more calves. If that's $2,000 more, well, we've made $2 an acre more. I mean, it's not a huge amount. It's not a game breaker, but it's substantial. $2 an acre. I think we could be more aggressive in increasing our stocking rates, except that I've been burned so bad by this drought, and we have droughts in southeastern Colorado. You're always either coming into one or just coming out of one, it seems like. And I would rather have a cushion, a stockpile ahead of me, as opposed to utilizing it to its maximum, and then as soon as I hit a dry spot, having to destock almost immediately. Now, this is the number one reason, and this is the one that, I mean, to me, this is the only reason that I need to have to do rotational grazing. And that is, it's this simple. I rest my ranch 340 days out of the year. Now, if you can rest your ranch for 340 days and graze it for 25, then during that 340 days, if it rains, you're going to grow grass, and you're going to, if there's no cattle grazing, everything in that pasture, every species of grass has equal opportunity to grow. And as I say, things have to be simple for me to understand them, but if I have, say, 15 pastures, just for simplicity's sake, if I have 15 pastures and they're all the same size, and they all have the same carrying capacity, and I concentrate my cattle into one herd, and I run them through all these pastures, 365 days divided by 15 pastures is 24 days of use. And that leaves 341 days of rest. Now, the rest of it is just fine-tuning, in my opinion. I go through several times a year. I don't just go 25, 25, 25. I go through several times a year depending on how fast the grass is growing. I don't graze the same pasture at the same time of the year, year after year. I stagger that. And I vary the speed that I rotate the cattle with depending on the grass growth. Whether it's raining late summer or in the spring, you have to monitor this in order to make it work. But the point is, if I can give my range 340 days of rest out of 365, that's the bottom line to me. Now, as I thought about it, those are my main reasons for using rotational grazing. And then I thought about it a little further, and I thought, maybe this may be the real number one reason. It's because I can and because I want to. And you think about that, I don't mean to be facetious about that, but not all ranches lend themselves as easily to rotational grazing as some others. You need water. And I'll tell you right now that we could not have done the projects that we've done without help from EQIP programs and technical help from NRCS. I just didn't have the resources personally to go and do this. But we put in 9 miles of pipeline and 10 new water tanks. One of the first things in a lot of arid climates that you've got to consider is you're no longer watering 20 cows at this trough, you're watering 200. And you've got to have a means of providing those cattle with sufficient water if they're all in one herd all at one time. And it took a lot of fencing. We put in 9.5 miles of barbed wire and 9 miles of electric fence. Now, there's ways to get around that. We could have used all electric fence. You could talk about maybe through water placement moving the cattle around, but it did require that much fence. And you know, fencing is getting up to $8,000 to $10,000 a mile now. And in my opinion, you needed small enough pastures to move cattle. We move cattle sometimes every 2 or 3 days during real rapid growth periods. And you know, we now have 28 pastures rather than 10. We have pastures that generally they're 1,000 to 1,500 acres. So I mean, it doesn't have to be real small pastures, but it's just logistically hard to go together in much more country than that. And Andy, my son, does it by himself. And as I say, does it real frequently in periods of real rapid growth. This is something that, with my experience at Spade Ranches, is a major situation. Is your pastures have to be clear enough that you can move those cattle frequently. We have so much mesquite and cedar and cactus on our ranches in Texas that when we're branding, if I take 8 or 10 men and we make as good a drive as we can, if we can get 90% of our cows gathered, we've really done good. So if you're in a rapid rotation and you're and you're dropping 10% every time you gather, by the time you get around, you don't have any cattle when you get back around. They're all waiting on you in the cattle that you came from. And then, this may be the most important one, you need the desire by the operator to participate in this activity over the long haul. And that, as Richard touched on the other day, is big. That is significant. Now, it's one thing to get somebody to buy into this for 6 months or a year, but when you're going to be doing this year after year after year, you've got to have someone really committed to it, because it's frankly a lot easier, especially on the gray matter in your head, if you'll just put 20, 30 cows in every pasture and drive around, check water, check the fence, check the cattle in those pastures. If you are doing this management intensive kind of grazing, you've got to be constantly thinking, adjusting, pulling cattle quicker, slowing them down, and so you've got to have a man that's really dedicated to this whole concept. And then I think something else that's significant as we look at this is there is a considerable amount of upfront costs here. As I said, we were able to participate through government EQIP programs and get help. But you've got to look at the whole picture, and you've got to say, is this economically feasible? If all this helps and makes my country look prettier, but it doesn't generate me another dollar, then I've got to question whether I can spend that dollar. So there's some real analysis has to go into this. Can I, with my existing resources, afford to do these things and get enough benefit to pay for them over time? Ranching is an extremely complex activity. I come to a meeting like this in the last 2 days, and our big emphasis has been on range. Well, that's valid, and it needs to be talked about. But you've also got to talk about things like your cattle, the type of cattle you're going to grow that will work for your country. And that reminds me of a story I got to tell. I got time, I think. One time I had the privilege of getting to eat supper with Benny Binion, who owned the, the Nugget out in Las Vegas. He was one of, back in the old days, before the mega casinos. And I got to eat supper with him out in Vegas. And he also has ranches in Montana, or had ranches in Montana. And I asked Mr. Binion, I said, out here around Vegas, do you run any cattle out here? And he said, well, we worked on it, and all we've ever gotten to that would work out here is a line of cattle I developed. They're called 470s, and they get along pretty good. Well, I didn't want to sound stupid, so I just, oh, well, that's good, and we went along. Well, a fellow that was with me, he finally said, Mr. Binion, I've got to ask. He said, I am not familiar with these cattle that you call 470s. You say you developed them? He said, yes, that's right. Can you tell me something about them? He said, yeah, they're out here in Vegas, and we use them out here in this country, and we call them 470s because they have a mouth 4 feet wide and they graze 70 miles an hour. So that's a guy that had developed the type of cattle that worked for his country. But that's one of the things you've got to concentrate on. Markets, you've got to be thinking about your marketing strategy. How am I going to sell these calves? Am I going to hold them over? Am I going to feed them out? Or all the economics of everything that you're doing. Personnel management, which is a big part of my job at Spades, is motivating personnel that are not constantly under your supervision. You know, it's a little different being a cowpuncher versus working on an assembly line, because if I can't get a guy to buy into my ideas and have him invest in those ideas, when I drive off, he can just go lay up under a shade tree. You know, it takes a long time to figure out if a guy's not doing. One of the favorite sayings I've always heard is, being a cowboy will build a character if you have any to start with. And so you better hire a guy that's got something to start with. Because if he's coming in and it's almost dark and he finds no cow bogged down in the river, he can just ride right around her, go on to the house, and in 2 or 3 days say, boy, I found a gold cow dead in the river down there. So he's got to be the kind of guy that knows he's not going to get any kind of allocates for pulling her out. It's just he did it because that was the thing to do. And then once you think about all of these things and your interaction with government agencies, you have to know how all these factors interrelate. In other words, how can I take that grass production and match it with a cow's reproductive cycle? You can have a great grazing component, and if you're not calving your cows when you ought to be calving them, you're going to have a lot of trouble. You're going to have reproductive problems. You've got to think about, how do I market my cattle in the best way? Now we've got all kinds of options. With this cool legislation, you've got country of origin you've got to think about. You may want to go to organic beef. You may want to use all natural programs. And there's just a lot of interrelationships that you have to balance as you ranch. Let me talk about this, because this is something that I think, this is a topic that we've discussed over the last 2 days. Those of you that haven't been here over the last 2 days, I'll just briefly say there's been some scientific studies recently among the range science community that are purporting that they can. There had been no scientific studies that show that rotational grazing is any more beneficial than moderately stocked continual grazing. And I'd like to give you my take on that, because I get to stand up here and talk. So I'm going to talk about that. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with them saying there are no studies that show one is better than the other. All I got to say about that is, you don't know how to put the study together. You know, it's not. I know it's better, but if you haven't put together a study that shows that, that's not on me. That's on the scientists. Maybe, and let me show you what I think will be one of the greatest hurdles in ever getting a study done that proves that. In my opinion, this is the way you make range improvements over a long period of time with grazing, with a different grazing system. And my point is, very gradually, very gradually. We've been on that ranch down there now for 16 years. I think I'm about 10% of the way there. I think it's like I heard a fellow say, grazing, the good news is, figuring out the correct grazing system is very simple once you get it figured out. The bad news is it takes about 80 years to figure it out. And I think he's about right. But let's say that you're striving for this gradual improvement of your range conditions. Now let me overlay this on there. This is our actual rainfall on that ranch of ours for the last 16 years. And that is those numbers on the left, that's a percentage of normal. You see, we've had as much as 325% of normal in a 2-month period. These are 2-month intervals. And we've been down as low as about 15%. When I bought the ranch, it was right about in through here. And if you see, if this is 100% of normal, we had, let me see, I wrote it down, although I may not can find it, but from 92 to 2001, 35 intervals were above average and 20 were below, and I had the science of grazing and growing grass totally figured out. I mean, it was pretty simple. And my curve was probably, rather than going like this, it was probably going like this. Well, then here comes 2001, 2002. And as I said earlier, by 2002 I had 34 cows on the ranch, and I didn't figure it made any difference what what was the point of even trying to ranch. Those, I will assure you, are very discouraging times. And then Andy took over in 2003, And boy, he figured out to get it to raining again. And when he did, that was the whole key. I was just not scheduling enough rain frequently enough. So he got real smart, and we went back into a period where we had pretty much average rainfall. We had about as many intervals above as below. Then we had real good intervals of rain here in 07. But then in 08, I mean, it doesn't take long for it to turn around. And in 08, we had several intervals below average right in here. And I mean, we were getting ready for seriously, by July, we were getting ready for the next exodus. You know, we had lined up some pasture in Kansas. We'd also developed a plan for which cattle we were going to sell first. And then it went back to raining in July and August, and we got smart again. And that is exactly what happens. You're trying to measure this progress. It's like sitting in a boat trying to measure the horizon in centimeters while your boat's jumping up and down meters at a time. It's just hard to pick any of these periods and come up with how much good your grazing system is doing versus how much good rainfall is doing. But the question is, okay, if we haven't come up with the right yardstick for measuring these things, then does that mean we shouldn't be doing it? Does that mean that we should abandon the idea of these rotational grazing systems? Well, my analogy of this is this. There's a picture that Charlie Russell did called Jerk Down, that right there, the horses are all in the right position, the cows are all in the right position, but that is not a picture he did. This is. Now, as a scientist, tell me how you quantify why that copy is not as good as the original. You can't do it. I mean, everything's in exactly the same position. The cowboys are doing the exact same activity, but I can tell you right now that's better than that one. And I think most all of you would agree it is. So I guess what I'm saying is, just because you can't measure it, I'm not going to quit doing it. I'm glad that Charlie Russell didn't have some scientists say, we can't tell you why yours is better than that, and he just said, well, then I'm going to quit. It's there. Y'all just got to figure out how to measure it. Now, the last thing I was going to say is, I've seen several studies, several papers presented these last few days that talk about performance of cattle, and it's always pounds gained, and always, in other words, it's always, everybody's measuring pounds that cattle gain. Well, this is a cow-calf operation that we're running, and I wanted to show you this because I think you should measure it in reproductive performance of the cattle. Our mature cows over the last 4 years have averaged a 97% breed up. Our 2-year-olds, 88%. That's not as good as I would like for it to be. And our replacement's 92. But my point is, I think that when you have plenty of good forage ahead of your cattle, you're going to get better reproductive performance than you will if they're just scattered out on a continual grazing. Now, I know this is probably reflective of the whole system. I mean, it's the kind of cattle you're running, it's your calving intervals, but I promise you that nutrition has a significant impact on that. Here's our weaning weights. Our mature cows, the steers and heifers, have averaged 589 during that period and 490. I don't think we can get much bigger than that, because I don't think we can use the larger, heavier milking type of cow that would require, that you would have to do that. But that's just what our last 4 years have been. In closing, I would say this, and I think this is very important. Ranching is an art form that must be handled in a business-like manner. I don't know how you quantify that, but I can tell you this. it's got to be sustainable in order to be profitable, unless you've got someone that's pouring outside capital into the operation. But if you are going to make this over the long haul, if you're going to make it in the ranching business, you'd better be sustainable. You had better be you had better not be robbing from Peter to pay Paul, or else you won't be in business very long. So I guess if I would say that if we need to reduce these things to decimal points and pounds of forage, that's probably a good thing, because we need to somehow prove it to ourselves. But at this point, I would say I'm pretty happy with the picture that we're painting, and I think that we need to keep in mind that there's a lot more observation and art form in some of this grazing than there is science. That's really all I had, but I'd take a few questions if anybody had any. Yes, sir.
What size of cows are you raising? You running?
Well,
How big?
Gordon, that can start me on a whole different subject. That's what I talked about last year. The first thing I'll say is I run a composite cow that's a Simmental, Angus, and Gelbvieh mix. So everybody says, well, how can you run a big exotic cross cow like that in that country down there? The average milk EPD for the Angus breed right now is 1 pound above the average milk EPD for Simmentals. Frame score in the Angus is bigger than, at Clay Center, is bigger than the Gelbvieh cows. So I try to engineer a very moderate hybrid cow that will weigh. We weighed all of our mature cows this fall after weaning, but they were fat because we had a real good fall, and they weighed 1178. In answer to your question. Yes, sir. Uh-oh, not Roy. Uh-oh.
John, what's an acceptable rate of change relative to your management program, and how do you know?
That's a great question, and I don't know, because, as I said, when we were getting a lot of when we were getting plentiful rainfall, my gosh, it was 20% a year. I mean, it was phenomenal. But then in 2002, and I'm serious, in 2002, I was this close to abandoning any type of range rotational grazing, because we were going down, and I mean we were going down precipitously, and that's why we completely destocked. But I do think that when it rained, we came back so much faster. But over the long haul, any improvement is good enough for me. But I think that, like I say, I don't think it'd take but 100 years, something like that. Yes, sir.
I appreciate what you're saying. I'm also a wheat cattle farmer out. But you have not addressed anything that's really pressing right now is CRP that's coming out of contract. And I've been chided, I guess, because I've got some CRP. But we have failed in your rain situation that we had CRP that could have been utilized by outsiders to great benefit and helped you not have to displace your herd. And that's where, working together, we can make a bigger difference than we are the way we're going.
Yes, sir. I agree. And talking about using CRP, we used quite a bit of it down there in Texas. Now, it's a learning curve, and you better put out protein, because that ground has been, that grass community has been abused because it hasn't been grazed. And that, to me, is abuse of grazing land. And in order to get it back to being a functional ecosystem again, you've got to graze it off. And we found by putting out protein tubs, we could get that grass seed off, and then we could go back to getting a functioning, working grazing system going again.
And with that, you wound up improving that CRP for the long run.
Yes, sir.
More than you took off of it.
I agree. I think it's got to be a functioning system in order to work. Thank you.